It was a busy Monday morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates, the smell of coffee from nearby cabs filling the air. Among the crowd walked Dr. Marcus Chen, pulling his small black carry-on suitcase with one hand while holding his phone in the other. At 45 years old, Dr. Chen carried himself with quiet confidence. His perfectly pressed navy blue suit and polished black shoes reflected his attention to detail, a trait that had helped him become one of Chicago's most respected heart surgeons. Today, he was heading to San Francisco to give an important speech at the annual cardiac surgery conference. Gate B17, he muttered to himself, checking his boarding pass one more time. He had arrived early, as was his habit. Being punctual was something his parents had taught him since childhood, a value he still held dear. The flight attendants at the gate were just beginning to prepare for boarding when he arrived. Dr. Chen sat down in the waiting area, taking out his laptop to review his presentation slides one last time. The presentation represented months of research on a new surgical technique he had developed. His work could potentially save thousands of lives, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Now boarding Group F for Flight UA 285 to San Francisco, the gate agent announced over the speakers. Dr. Chen packed up his laptop and joined the line. He had splurged on a business class ticket, knowing he needed to be well rested for his presentation tomorrow. Walking down the jet bridge, he smiled politely at Jennifer Torres, the flight attendant greeting passengers at the door. She returned his smile warmly. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard." Her name tag sparkled under the cabin lights, and her uniform was crisp and neat. Dr. Chen made his way through the business class cabin to his seat, 3A, a window seat on the left side of the plane. He liked window seats. They reminded him of his first flight as a child, when his father had let him sit by the window and explained how planes stayed in the air. That memory had sparked his lifelong love of science. After storing his carry-on in the overhead bin, he settled into his seat. The leather was soft and comfortable, and there was plenty of legroom. He took out his presentation notes and a medical journal from his briefcase, placing them neatly in the seat pocket in front of him. The cabin slowly filled with other passengers. A young mother with a baby sat across the aisle, and an elderly gentleman took the seat in front of him. Dr. Chen noticed how the flight attendants, including Jennifer Torres and her colleague Michael Baker, helped passengers with their bags and answered questions with patience and professionalism. He checked his watch. 9:45 a.m. The flight was scheduled to depart at 10:15 a.m. Perfect timing. If everything went according to schedule, he would have plenty of time to check into his hotel and prepare for tomorrow's presentation. Through the window, Dr. Chen watched the ground crew loading luggage and performing their final checks. The morning sun reflected off the plane's wing, and he could see other aircraft taking off in the distance. It was a clear day, perfect flying weather. He took a sip from his water bottle and adjusted his seat slightly. Years of flying had taught him the importance of staying hydrated and comfortable during long flights. The 6-hour journey to San Francisco would give him time to finalize his speech and maybe catch up on some much-needed rest. As more passengers boarded, the familiar sounds of an airplane preparing for departure filled the cabin, overhead blinds clicking shut, the rustle of bags being stowed, quiet conversations, and occasional announcements over the intercom. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the galley as the flight attendants prepared for beverage service. Dr. Chen pulled out his phone to send a quick text to his wife, Sarah. "On the plane now. We'll call when I land. Love you." He smiled at her reply. "Good luck with the presentation. We're all proud of you." Attached was a photo of their 2 children holding a hand-drawn "Good luck, Dad" sign. As he switched his phone to airplane mode, Dr. Chen had no idea that this routine flight would soon become anything but ordinary. The next few hours would test not only his patience but also the professionalism of the entire flight crew, and ultimately lead to a viral moment that would be shared millions of times across the internet. The peaceful atmosphere in the business class cabin changed when Sarah Williams rushed in, 15 minutes before the scheduled departure. She was a woman in her mid-50s, wearing expensive designer clothes and carrying several shopping bags from the duty-free store. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her diamond ring sparkled as she waved her boarding pass in the air. 3B, 3B, she muttered, walking down the aisle. When she reached her assigned seat next to Dr. Chen, she stopped abruptly. Her face changed from hurried to displeased in an instant. She looked at her boarding pass again, then at the seat number, as if hoping she had made a mistake. Jennifer Torres, the flight attendant who had greeted everyone earlier, noticed Mrs. Williams standing in the aisle, blocking other passengers. "Can I help you find your seat, ma'am?" she asked politely, approaching with a professional smile. Mrs. Williams turned to Jennifer, speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "There must be some mistake," she said, pointing at Dr. Chen without looking at him. "I paid full price for a business class ticket. I can't sit here." Dr. Chen looked up from his medical journal, his face showing surprise at first, then understanding as he realized what was happening. He had experienced similar situations before, but it never got easier. He remained silent, his hands gripping his journal a little tighter. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't understand the problem," Jennifer replied calmly. "This is your assigned seat. 3B. Is there something specific making you uncomfortable?" She knew exactly what the issue was but wanted Mrs. Williams to say it directly. Several passengers had stopped their conversations to watch. A young man 3 rows back quietly took out his phone and began recording. The mother with the baby across the aisle shook her head in disapproval at Mrs. Williams's behavior. "Look," Mrs. Williams lowered her voice to a harsh whisper, leaning closer to Jennifer. "I'm a frequent flyer. I spend thousands of dollars with this airline. Surely you can find me another seat." She glanced at Dr. Chen again, making her prejudices clear through her tone and body language. Jennifer stood her ground, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Ma'am, today's flight is completely full. Every seat in business class is assigned. Dr. Chen here is also a valued customer of our airline." She emphasized the word doctor, making it clear that she recognized his professional status. Mrs. Williams's face turned red. "Well, I never," she exclaimed. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. This is unacceptable. I can't spend 6 hours sitting next to," she paused, searching for words that wouldn't openly expose her racism. "I just need a different seat." More phones came out as passengers began recording the scene. The elderly gentleman in front turned around in his seat, frowning at Mrs. Williams. A businessman across the aisle closed his laptop, giving her a disapproving look. Throughout this exchange, Dr. Chen maintained his dignity. He sat straight in his seat, focusing on his medical journal, though anyone watching closely could see the tension in his shoulders. He had presented at hundreds of medical conferences, performed countless surgeries, and saved many lives, yet here he was, being judged solely by his appearance. Michael Baker, the lead flight attendant, noticed the commotion and approached. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tall frame and authoritative presence adding weight to his words. "Yes," Mrs. Williams said immediately. "I need to speak to the captain. This seating arrangement is completely unacceptable. I'm a platinum member." Jennifer quickly briefed Michael on the situation in professional, measured tones. Other passengers were now openly staring, and the atmosphere in the cabin had grown tense. The young mother across the aisle was comforting her baby, who had begun to fuss due to the raised voices. Michael nodded, understanding the situation completely. He took out his phone to call the captain, knowing this incident required higher authority. As he did so, Mrs. Williams stood in the aisle, tapping her expensive shoes impatiently and checking her watch repeatedly. The situation had escalated from a simple boarding process to what would soon become a viral moment of confronting everyday racism. No one in the cabin knew yet that this incident would be viewed millions of times across social media, sparking important conversations about prejudice and air travel etiquette. The tension in the business class cabin continued to build as Michael Baker returned from his call to the captain. More passengers had pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The soft hum of the airplane's engines mixed with whispered conversations as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Jennifer Torres stood firmly beside Dr. Chen's row, her years of flight attendant training evident in her professional stance. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this situation was different. The look in her eyes showed she wasn't going to let discrimination slide on her watch. "Ma'am," Michael began, addressing Mrs. Williams, "I've spoken with Captain Morrison. She suggests you take your assigned seat so we can maintain our departure schedule." His voice was calm but carried authority. The mention of a female captain seemed to surprise Mrs. Williams, adding to her visible frustration. Mrs. Williams crossed her arms, her expensive bracelets jingling. This is ridiculous. I've been flying with this airline for 20 years. I demand to see your supervisor's supervisor." Her voice had grown louder, causing several passengers to wince. The baby across the aisle started crying again. A businessman in row 4 spoke up, "Ma'am, we all have places to be. Please take your seat or let them give it to someone else." Others nodded in agreement. The solidarity among passengers was becoming clear. They weren't on Mrs. Williams's side. Dr. Chen continued reading his medical journal, but those nearby could see his hands trembling slightly. A young flight attendant named Sarah Kim approached him quietly and whispered, "Would you like some water, Dr. Chen?" This small act of kindness didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. Mrs. Williams noticed too. "Oh, so we get special treatment now?" she sneered. "This is reverse discrimination. I'm going to report all of you to corporate headquarters." She fumbled in her designer handbag for her phone, presumably to start recording herself. Michael stepped forward, his voice now firm and official. "Mrs. Williams, let me be very clear about our airline's policy. We have zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior of any kind. You have two choices right now. Take your assigned seat respectfully, or we'll need to find another passenger who will." The cabin grew quiet. Even the baby stopped crying, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Through the windows, the morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin, highlighting the tension on everyone's faces. Jennifer added professionally, "We have several passengers on our wait list who would be happy to upgrade to business class, Mrs. Williams. The choice is yours, but we need your decision now to maintain our schedule." A few rows back, a teenage girl whispered to her mother, "Mom, this is going viral on TikTok already." Indeed, the incident was being live-streamed by multiple passengers, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Dr. Chen finally looked up from his journal. His voice, when he spoke for the first time, was calm and measured. "I'd be happy to switch seats with another passenger if it would make things easier for everyone." This selfless offer made Mrs. Williams's behavior look even worse by comparison. Jennifer shook her head firmly. "That won't be necessary, Dr. Chen. You have every right to your assigned seat." Her response drew quiet applause from several passengers. The elderly gentleman in front turned around and gave Dr. Chen a supportive nod. Mrs. Williams's face flushed deeper red. She looked around the cabin, perhaps finally realizing that no one supported her position. The cameras pointed at her from various angles seemed to make her increasingly uncomfortable. Michael checked his watch. They were now 10 minutes behind schedule. "Mrs. Williams, we need your final decision. Are you taking your seat, or should I call for your luggage to be removed?" The atmosphere was electric. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, waiting for her response. Outside the plane, ground crew members could be seen going about their duties, unaware of the drama unfolding inside. Sarah Kim returned with water for Dr. Chen, placing it carefully on his tray table. This simple act of service seemed to emphasize the airline crew's united stand against discrimination. Other flight attendants had gathered nearby, their presence showing silent support for their colleagues' handling of the situation. The entire incident had transformed from a simple seating dispute into a powerful moment of people standing together against prejudice. What happened next would not only determine the fate of this flight, but would also become a viral symbol of how to handle racism in public spaces. Captain Patricia Morrison walked into the business class cabin with purposeful steps. At 55 years old, with short gray hair and her pilot's uniform perfectly pressed, she commanded respect the moment she appeared. The cabin fell completely silent. Even Mrs. Williams stopped her complaints mid-sentence. Two more flight attendants, David Rodriguez and Lisa Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, joined their colleagues. The entire crew now stood together, creating an impressive sight in their crisp uniforms. Their united presence sent a clear message about where they stood on this issue. "I'm Captain Morrison," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. "I understand we have a situation here that's delaying our departure." She looked directly at Mrs. Williams, who suddenly seemed much smaller in her expensive clothing. The captain's 25 years of flying experience showed in how calmly she handled the situation. Mrs. Williams tried to regain her confidence. "Finally, someone in charge," she said, stepping toward the captain. "I've been trying to explain to your crew that I need a different seat. This is a simple customer service issue." She glanced around nervously, aware that at least 12 phones were still recording everything. Captain Morrison raised her eyebrows slightly. Mrs. Williams, I've been briefed on the situation. Let me share some information with you. She pulled out a tablet from her uniform pocket. I checked your flight history with us. You've been a platinum member for 3 years. She then turned to Dr. Chen, who sat quietly watching the scene unfold. Dr. Chen, on the other hand, has been flying with us for 15 years. He's actually logged more miles than you. Several passengers smiled at this revelation. Mrs. Williams's mouth opened in surprise. Michael Baker stepped forward with a clipboard. Captain, we're now 15 minutes behind schedule. Gate 17 is trying to contact us about our departure slot. He spoke professionally, but everyone understood the growing pressure of the delay. The young mother across the aisle had finally gotten her baby to sleep. She looked relieved, but worried the confrontation might wake him again. Other passengers checked their watches and phones, concerned about their connections in San Francisco. Captain Morrison nodded and turned back to Mrs. Williams. Here's what's going to happen, she said firmly. In exactly 2 minutes, we're closing the aircraft door. You have until then to decide. Sit in your assigned seat respectfully, or leave the plane. If you choose to stay, I expect you to treat both our crew and your fellow passengers with complete respect. Mrs. Williams looked around desperately, perhaps hoping someone would support her, but found only disapproving faces. The teenage girl who mentioned TikTok earlier whispered excitedly to her mother, "This is getting thousands of views already." Jennifer Torres and Sarah Kim stood protectively near Dr. Chen's row. David Rodriguez moved to the front of the cabin, ready to either close the door or escort Mrs. Williams off the plane. Lisa Chen waited near the storage closet, where Mrs. Williams's carry-on items had been stowed. The captain checked her watch. 1 minute remaining, Mrs. Williams. Her tone was professional but left no room for argument. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the decision. Dr. Chen continued his dignified silence, but he sat straighter in his seat. The elderly gentleman in front had turned completely around in his seat to watch, his face showing clear support for the crew's actions. The businesswoman across the aisle closed her laptop completely and removed her earphones, not wanting to miss what would happen next. Other passengers in economy class had heard about the situation, and several heads peeked around the dividing curtain. 30 seconds, Captain Morrison announced calmly. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, the very picture of professional authority. The other crew members remained in their positions, creating a united front that showed their complete solidarity. Mrs. Williams's face went through several emotions: anger, embarrassment, confusion, and finally, something that looked like defeat. She glanced at her expensive watch, then at her designer handbag, then at all the phones still recording her every move. The next few seconds would determine not just the fate of this flight, but would become a textbook example of how airline crews should handle discrimination. The video would soon be seen by millions, sparking discussions about privilege, prejudice, and professionalism in the airline industry. As the final seconds of Captain Morrison's ultimatum ticked away, Mrs. Williams's shoulders suddenly dropped. The change in her body language was visible to everyone watching. The designer handbag she had been clutching so tightly lowered to her side, and her face showed a mix of embarrassment and resignation. "Fine," she muttered, barely loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'll sit down." She didn't make eye contact with anyone as she finally moved toward her assigned seat, 3B. The clicking sounds of phone cameras followed her every movement. Jennifer Torres stepped forward efficiently. "Let me help you with your bags, Mrs. Williams," she said professionally, though her tone was notably cooler than her usual warm greeting. She helped store the duty-free shopping bags in the overhead compartment, maintaining the high standards of service despite the situation. Dr. Chen shifted slightly to allow Mrs. Williams to take her seat, his movements careful and dignified. He returned to his medical journal, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. This simple act of grace made several passengers shake their heads in admiration. Captain Morrison remained standing in the aisle, watching to ensure the situation was truly resolved. "Mrs. Williams," she said firmly, "I want to be very clear. If there is any further disruption during this flight, any at all, we will divert to the nearest airport and have you removed. Do you understand?" Mrs. Williams nodded stiffly, her face now a deep shade of red. Her expensive jewelry clinked as she fastened her seatbelt, trying to look anywhere but at the passengers around her. The baby across the aisle made a small noise, and his mother quickly rocked him, hoping to keep him asleep. Dr. Chen, Captain Morrison continued, her voice warming considerably. On behalf of the airline, I apologize for this delay and disruption. Is there anything we can get you before takeoff? Several passengers nodded approvingly at the captain's handling of the situation. Dr. Chen smiled politely. No, thank you, Captain. I appreciate how you and your crew have handled everything. His quiet dignity in the face of discrimination had won him the respect of everyone in the cabin. The elderly gentleman in front turned around again and gave him a thumbs up. Captain Morrison nodded and addressed the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll be pushing back from the gate in approximately 5 minutes. Thank you for your patience. She turned and walked back to the cockpit, her posture remaining perfectly professional. Michael Baker, the lead flight attendant, began the standard safety preparations. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to close the aircraft doors. Please ensure your carry-on items are properly stowed. His familiar announcement helped return a sense of normalcy to the cabin. The other flight attendants moved efficiently through their pre-flight duties. Sarah Kim made a point of checking on Dr. Chen one more time, quietly asking if he needed a fresh glass of water. Jennifer Torres kept a watchful eye on Mrs. Williams while helping other passengers with their final preparations. The teenage girl who had been recording everything whispered excitedly to her mother, "Mom, the video already has 50,000 views." Her mother shushed her, but the news spread quickly through the cabin. Several passengers were now checking their phones, watching the incident go viral in real time. Outside the window, the morning sun continued to shine brightly as ground crew members removed the jet bridge. The sounds of the airplane's engines grew louder as they prepared for pushback. Normal airport activities continued, unaware of the significant moment of social justice that had just occurred inside the aircraft. Mrs. Williams sat stiffly in her seat, trying to appear absorbed in the safety card from the seat pocket. She had finally realized that her actions would have consequences far beyond this flight. The phones recording her had captured everything, and her behavior would soon be seen by millions. Dr. Chen calmly turned a page in his medical journal, his presentation notes neatly arranged on his tray table. Despite the unpleasant situation, he remained focused on his upcoming speech at the cardiac surgery conference. His professional demeanor throughout the incident had spoken volumes about his character. As the plane finally began to push back from the gate, a quiet sense of victory settled over the cabin. The crew had stood firm against discrimination, the passengers had united in support of what was right, and justice had prevailed. This flight would soon become famous for all the right reasons, showing the world how to handle prejudice with professionalism and dignity. The flight from Chicago to San Francisco had been in the air for 2 hours when the videos of the incident started going truly viral. Passengers with in-flight Wi-Fi watched in amazement as the view counts climbed into the hundreds of thousands. The teenager who first posted it on TikTok could hardly contain her excitement as her video reached 1 million views. Mrs. Williams remained unusually quiet in her seat, pretending to sleep behind her expensive designer sunglasses. She hadn't touched the drink Jennifer Torres had professionally offered her during beverage service. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications in her purse, but she ignored it. Dr. Chen worked steadily on his presentation, occasionally sipping the fresh coffee that the flight attendants made sure was always full. Other passengers kept glancing at him with respect, impressed by his calm dignity throughout the entire situation. Some even recognized him from their hospitals back home. Sarah Kim, one of the flight attendants, quietly approached their row. "Dr. Chen," she whispered, "we've received several messages from first-class passengers offering to switch seats with you." She glanced meaningfully at Mrs. Williams, who pretended not to hear but visibly stiffened in her seat. Dr. Chen smiled kindly but shook his head. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. I'm quite comfortable here." His response made several nearby passengers smile. The elderly gentleman in front turned around and whispered, "Good for you, son." Meanwhile, in the galley, the flight crew checked their phones during their breaks. The videos had spread to every major social media platform. #AirlineCrew and #StandAgainstRacism were trending topics. Their airline's corporate office had already released a statement fully supporting the crew's actions. "Look at these comments." David Rodriguez showed his phone to Jennifer Torres. People are praising Captain Morrison and calling us heroes. Jennifer smiled but reminded him they still had a job to do. They both returned to their duties, maintaining their professionalism despite their newfound internet fame. The baby across the aisle, who had slept through most of the flight, woke up hungry. His mother nervously began preparing a bottle, worried about disturbing anyone after the earlier drama. To everyone's surprise, Sarah Kim appeared immediately with a warm bottle of milk. "We took the liberty of preparing this when we saw your little one stirring," she said kindly. 4 hours into the flight, a minor bout of turbulence caused the seatbelt sign to come on. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Mrs. Williams finally removed her sunglasses to check her phone. Her face went pale as she scrolled through countless notifications. Her name was already being mentioned in news articles. Someone had recognized her and posted about her business connections. The consequences of her actions were becoming crystal clear. The businessman across the aisle, who had been quiet throughout the flight, suddenly spoke up. "You know, Dr. Chen, I saw your name on the conference schedule. I'm looking forward to your presentation on the new cardiac procedure." This sparked a quiet but friendly conversation about medical advancements, deliberately ignoring Mrs. Williams's presence. Jennifer Torres did another pass through the cabin, demonstrating the same high level of service to everyone, including Mrs. Williams. Her professional behavior showed exactly why the airline crew was receiving such praise on social media. Other passengers noticed and several made notes to commend her in their customer feedback. As they passed over Nevada, the teenager's TikTok video hit 5 million views. News websites were picking up the story, praising the airline's zero-tolerance approach to discrimination. Reporters were already gathering at San Francisco International Airport, hoping to interview the crew and passengers. Dr. Chen received an email from the conference organizers. They had heard about the incident and wanted to add a last-minute panel discussion about diversity in medicine, asking him to participate. He quietly accepted, understanding the importance of using this moment to create positive change. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom again, this time announcing they were beginning their descent into San Francisco. As passengers prepared for landing, there was a sense that they had all been part of something important. A moment when people stood together against discrimination and chose to do what was right. The story of Flight UA 285 would be remembered not just for the initial conflict, but for how a group of professionals handled it with grace, dignity, and unwavering principles. None of them knew yet just how big an impact their actions would have in the coming days. By the time Flight UA 285 landed in San Francisco, the incident had exploded across the internet. The original TikTok video had reached over 10 million views, and dozens of news websites were running the story. The airport was buzzing with activity as reporters gathered near the arrival gate, the cameras ready. Dr. Chen's phone lit up with hundreds of messages as soon as he turned off airplane mode. His hospital colleagues, family members, and even old medical school friends had seen the videos. Many were sending messages of support and sharing their own similar experiences. Mrs. Williams rushed off the plane first, trying to hide her face behind her designer handbag. Several passengers booed as she hurried past, and someone shouted, "Shame on you." She nearly ran through the terminal, desperately trying to avoid the waiting cameras and reporters. The flight crew emerged from the plane to unexpected applause. Other airline staff, airport workers, and waiting passengers had seen the viral videos and gathered to show their support. Captain Morrison led her team with the same quiet dignity she had shown during the incident. "Captain Morrison," reporters called out, holding up microphones and cameras. "Can you tell us about what happened on the flight?" Television crews from local stations pushed forward, their bright lights illuminating the terminal. Jennifer Torres's phone was overwhelmed with friend requests and follows on social media. Someone had started a hashtag #BelightJennifer, praising her professional handling of the situation. Her sister called to say she had seen her on the morning news. The teenage girl who first posted the TikTok video was giving interviews near the baggage claim. "I just knew I had to record it," she explained to a reporter. "People need to see that standing up to racism is important." Her video had sparked hundreds of response videos from other users sharing similar stories. Twitter was ablaze with reactions. Celebrity activists shared the video, praising the airline crew's response. Civil rights organizations released statements commending Captain Morrison's leadership. Even politicians were tweeting about the incident, calling it an example of how to handle discrimination properly. Dr. Chen tried to quietly make his way to the taxi stand, but passengers from the flight kept stopping him to shake his hand. "Your dignity was inspiring," one elderly woman told him, tears in her eyes. "My grandchildren needed to see someone handle hatred with such grace." The airline's social media team was working overtime. Their official statement supporting the crew had received millions of likes. "We stand firmly against discrimination of any kind. Our crew demonstrated the values we strive to uphold every day. We are proud of their professionalism and courage." News channels were running special segments about the incident. Aviation experts praised Captain Morrison's handling of the situation. Former flight attendants shared stories of similar experiences, saying this crew's response should become standard training material. Mrs. Williams's business partners were quickly distancing themselves. Her company's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. Someone had started a petition calling for her removal from several charity board positions. Her carefully built social image was crumbling with each share of the video. LinkedIn users were particularly impressed with Dr. Chen's composure. Medical professionals from around the world commented on how his behavior reflected the best values of their profession. Several hospitals posted about the importance of diversity in healthcare, using the incident as an example. Michael Baker, the lead flight attendant, found himself being interviewed by a major news network. "We were just doing our jobs," he said modestly. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect when they fly with us." His simple statement was shared thousands of times within hours. The younger flight attendants, Sarah Kim, David Rodriguez, and Lisa Chen, were surprised to find fan accounts being created in their honor. People praised how the entire crew worked together, showing that unity against discrimination crosses all racial and ethnic lines. Facebook groups devoted to customer service training began analyzing the video, pointing out how each crew member contributed to the successful handling of the situation. Airlines around the world started receiving requests to include this case in their training materials. By evening, the story had gone international. News outlets from Europe, Asia, and Australia were running the story. The incident was becoming more than just a viral moment. It was sparking important conversations about racism, professional responsibility, and the power of standing together against discrimination. The social media storm showed no signs of slowing down. The hashtags kept trending, the view counts kept rising, and the impact of what happened on Flight UA 285 continued to grow. What started as one passenger's prejudice had transformed into a powerful message about dignity, respect, and doing what's right. 1 week after the flight from Chicago to San Francisco, the impact of the incident continued to create positive changes across the country. The airline had turned a potentially negative situation into a powerful moment of corporate leadership against discrimination. Captain Patricia Morrison appeared on several major morning talk shows. Dressed in her pilot's uniform, she spoke with the same quiet authority she had shown on the flight. "It wasn't just about one passenger or one incident," she explained. "It was about showing that discrimination has no place in our society." Dr. Chen's medical conference speech had received a standing ovation. Instead of just discussing cardiac surgery, he had shared his experience from the flight. "Medicine, like aviation, is about serving all people equally," he told the audience. "The color of someone's skin should never determine how they are treated." The airline announced new training programs inspired by the incident. They named it the Morrison Protocol after the captain, making it required training for all staff. Other airlines quickly followed, adopting similar policies for handling discrimination on flights. Mrs. Williams had faced serious consequences for her actions. Her company asked her to step down from her executive position. Her country club membership was suspended. Local newspapers reported that she had enrolled in diversity awareness classes, trying to repair her damaged reputation. Jennifer Torres and her fellow flight attendants were honored at the airline's headquarters. The CEO personally thanked them for upholding the company's values. They received promotions and were asked to help develop the new training materials for handling similar situations. The teenage girl's TikTok video had reached 50 million views. Schools were using it in their social studies classes to discuss modern civil rights. Teachers reported that students were more willing to speak up against bullying and discrimination after seeing the video. Major companies contacted the airline about corporate training partnerships. They wanted to learn how to handle discrimination in their own businesses. The airline's stock price rose as investors recognized their strong ethical stance as good for business. Dr. Chen received hundreds of letters from young people of color who wanted to become doctors or pilots. "Seeing you stay calm and dignified showed me how to handle tough situations," one young student wrote. He started a mentorship program to help minority students enter medical school. The elderly gentleman who had supported Dr. Chen from the seat in front came forward with his own story. A retired judge, he wrote a powerful opinion piece for a major newspaper about how small acts of support can help fight discrimination. Sarah Kim, the flight attendant who had quietly supported Dr. Chen, was invited to speak at her former high school. "Sometimes courage is just doing your job properly," she told the students. "Standing up for what's right doesn't always mean being loud. It can mean being professionally firm." The airline created a new customer policy, making it clear that discriminatory behavior would result in immediate removal from flights and placement on a no-fly list. Other transportation companies adopted similar policies for their buses and trains. Captain Morrison received a special award from the Airline Pilots Association. During her acceptance speech, she emphasized team effort. Every person on that crew, from the newest flight attendant to the most experienced staff, showed what it means to be true professionals. Mrs. Williams's story became a warning about the consequences of discrimination in the modern age. Business schools used it as a case study about how social media can quickly expose and punish bad behavior. Her experience showed that privilege couldn't protect people from the consequences of discrimination. The baby from the flight and his mother appeared in a heartwarming follow-up story. They had started a social media campaign called Kindness at 30,000 Feet, sharing positive stories about air travel and human dignity. Dr. Chen continued his important cardiac surgery work, but also found time to write a book about handling discrimination with dignity. "The height of professionalism is treating others well even when they don't treat you well," became a famous quote from his book. The incident brought unexpected positive changes to the airline industry. Customer satisfaction scores went up as people felt safer knowing airlines would protect them from discrimination. More people of color applied for aviation jobs, knowing they would be supported. 1 year later, the flight crew reunited for a special ceremony. They received an award from a civil rights organization for their actions. Standing together on stage, they showed that the impact of doing the right thing could last far longer than the few hours of a flight from Chicago to San Francisco. Their story became part of training materials not just for airlines, but for hotels, restaurants, and other service industries. It showed that taking a stand against discrimination wasn't just morally right, it was good business practice too.